Okay, I'm back again, and I'm on to the seventh chapter of George and Marina, the Duke and Duchess of Kent. It was written by Christopher Warwick, and getting into the book, this is where it gets very interesting. This is where George and Marina are about to get married, and there's more information on the royal family and how they met and related. But this is a longer chapter, so it will take a little bit longer. But this is the seventh chapter, and there are 16 chapters. But it gets really good from this point onward. So I hope you stay with me. I'll start. Chapter 7, A King's Son. Prince George of Wales, as he was first known, was born at Sandringham on 20th December 1902. Thus, unlike his three elder brothers, who were born during the reign of their great-grandmama, Queen Victoria, Prince George was an Edwardian. His grandfather, King Edward VII, was about to enter the third year of his reign at the time of George's birth. On reflection, the idea of Prince George as an Edwardian somehow seems very appropriate, for the era that took his grandfather's name was a more romantic era associated with color and innovation, freedom of expression, freedom of style, overlaid with certain naughty frivolity, a world removed from the somber mood that epitomized all but the first 20 years of Victoria's reign. A man of his time, George was well suited to romance, color, style, and frivolity, even though some of the naughtier aspects of his adult life would give rise to serious concerns. York Cottage in the grounds of Sandringham House near King's Lynn in Norfolk, where Prince George was born, was originally known as the Bachelor's Cottage and still stands on the edge of the lower pond, one of the royal estate's two artificial lakes. Built by Edward VII when he was Prince of Wales as a guest accommodation, this relatively small two-story house was subsequently been given to Prince George's father, then the Duke of York, as a wedding present, and it was renamed in his honor. I did not know. I didn't make that. York's Cottage is named after George V when he was Duke of York. Interesting. Okay. Stuffed full of heavy modern furniture from the fashionable London firm Maples, overheated in winter, suffocating in summer, and permeated by cooking smells whatever the season, York Cottage was, for 33 years, the favorite residence of the Duke and the Duchess of York, even after they became the King George V and Queen Mary, ill proportioned for the growing family that lived there. The house was made up of a small entrance hall, the Duke's study or library, two medium sized drawing rooms, a dining room, and a billiard room. Upstairs, the Duke and Duchess each had a bedroom and a dressing room. Two or three further rooms were set aside for the use of equerries and ladies in waiting, while tucked away from behind a swing door were the day and night nurseries. All the York children slept in the night nursery, as did their nanny, Lala Bell. Prince George's father, another Prince George, was the second son of Bertie and Alex's Prince and Princess of Wales, who, on the death of Queen Victoria in January 1901, became King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. In July 1893, when he was 28, Bertie and Alex's son George, who had been created Duke of York just over a year before, married the 26-year-old Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, or May as she was known, the only daughter of Queen Victoria's cousin, the enormously popular Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, known to the Victorian public as Fat Mary, and her husband, Prince Franz, Duke of Teck. Princess May had been engaged to George's elder brother, Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, and Avondale, an Earl of Athlone. Known within the family as Eddie, he was slow, indolent, and unmotivated. His gentleness had irritated his father as much as it had endeared him to his overindulgent mother, known to her children as Mother Dear. Among the few things Prince Eddie really cared for was James Pope Hennessy, who would write in his official biography of Queen Mary, was every form of dissipation and amusement. The stories and rumors were legion, for Eddie frequently frequented a male brothel in the Cleveland Street in the West End to unfounded claims that he was Victorian London's notorious serial killer, Jack the Ripper. As was often the case in those days, the assumed steadying influence of marriage was regarded as the cure-all for young men of Eddie's disposition. And May of Teck, though excessively shy and reserved, was seen as the perfect candidate for the role of Eddie's wife, and in the fullness of time, his queen. Though not a love match, Eddie proposed. May accepted, and the wedding was arranged to take place on the 27th of February, 1892. Then, only 6 weeks before the event, fate diverted the course of history. At Sandringham, on the 6th of June, Eddie fell victim to the flu pandemic that recurred throughout 1889 to 1992. Within 3 days, influenza had developed into pneumonia, and on 14 January, 6 days after his 28th birthday, he died. For Princess May, however, the future remained unchanged. Approved by Queen Victoria as a suitable queen consort for Eddie, his brother George was now encouraged to think in terms of marrying May. Over the next 16 months, drawn together first by shared mourning, Georgie and May's affection for one another steadily grew to the point at which, on 3 May 1893, while visiting the Duke's sister, Princess Louise, Duchess of Fife, for tea at her house near Richmond, it was suggested that George should take May into the garden to look at the frogs in the pond. We walked together in the garden, May noted in her diary that evening, and he proposed to me, and I accepted. Louise and Macduff, the Duke of Fife, were delighted. I drove home to announce the news to Mama and Papa, and Georgie followed. We telegraphed to all the relations. 2 months later, on the 6th of July, Prince George, the Duke of York, and Princess May of Teck were married in the Chapel Royal at St. James Palace. To Queen Victoria, who sat draped in lace, fanning herself near the altar on the sultry afternoon, the Chapel Royal, even though it was where she and her dearest Albert had been married in February 1840, was small and very ugly. St. George's Chapel, Windsor, she declared, is a lovely place for a marriage in the summer. That afternoon, in what was an extraordinary lapse of taste and sensitivity, given that Eddie had died there so recently, the Duke of York took his new wife off to Sandringham and a honeymoon at York Cottage. Even Queen Victoria commented that the choice of venue seemed rather unlucky and sad. But as we've already seen, George's love affair with York Cottage started at a time and would be his and Mary's much-loved home for over 30 years. It was also there that 5 of their 6 children were born. Like Queen Victoria, the Duchess of York found everything to do with pregnancy, childbirth, and babies distasteful, not least because of the all unwelcome attention she received. Among the members of the royal family who were astonished by May's unwillingness to indulge in baby talk as Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, Vicky, the future Empress Frederick of Germany, who couldn't have been more interested in every detail connected with the birth of so celestial a being as a human being. After visiting May, whom she declared to be unmaternal, Vicky told her mother that she does not wish it remarked or mentioned. Nevertheless, at the end of the century, May had already given her husband 3 children. Edward, or David as he was known, was born just before his parents' first wedding anniversary. Albert, otherwise Bertie, who would one day reign as King George VI, and Victoria, the future Princess Royale, who was always known as Mary, the last of her 4 names. Henry, or Harry, the York's third son, was born when the 20th century was but 3 months old. Prince George, the future Duke of Kent, one of our 2 players, followed on the 20th of December 1902. Just 4 years almost to the day before his future wife, Princess Marina. Wow, that's pretty interesting. The youngest of the York's children was Prince John. Born not quite 3 years after Prince George, he was not only mentally slower than his siblings, but he had also had been epileptic. As a result, as was so often the case in those days, the young prince lived apart from the rest of the family, out of sight, though not out of mind. Johnny lived at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, where until his death, at the age of not quite 14, he was cared for by the family's devoted nanny, Lala Bill. In the later years, when the 4 surviving princes and their sister recalled their childhood, Sandringham always stood out in sharp focus, as indeed did their indulgent grandparents, King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, who lived up at the big house a quarter of a mile away through the park. Before David and Bertie were sent off to Royal Naval Colleges at Osborne and Dartmouth, they, like Princess Mary, were educated privately at York College. Like them, George and Harry's education also began there. Later on, while Harry was sent to Eton, his younger brother went off to St. Peter's Court Preparatory School at Broadstairs on the south coast. At the time of Prince George's engagement to Princess Marina, the Marquess of Donegal, a fellow pupil at St. Peter's, recalled one particular human impression of the schoolboy prince. In the Sunday Dispatch on 2 September 1934, he wrote, "In those days, Prince George, in contrast to his well-groomed appearance in later years, had an obstinate tuft of hair on the top of his head, which he refused to brush or comb. When more than usually puzzled over how long it would take A, B, or C to do the traditional piece of work, he would curl the recalcitrant tuft with an index finger of his left hand. This appeared to produce the required inspiration." Of the surviving royals, Prince George was academically the brightest. In fact, school reports from A.J. Richardson, his headmaster, were so pleasing that the prince's parents went to St. Peter's in person to thank him. "But, sir," said Richardson to the boy's father, "Prince George applies himself to every subject. It's a joy to teach such a child." Unfortunately, the same could not be said of either David or Bertie, who were repeatedly admonished for their lack of application and poor exam results. While Harry, afterwards, who became the Duke of Gloucester, was even poorer a student. "Do for goodness sake wake up and work harder and use the brain God has given you," wrote his exasperated mother when he was still at Eton. All the while, All you write about is your everlasting football, of which I am heartily sick. On November 1901, 10 months after the death of Queen Victoria, the accession of King Edward VII, George, Duke of York, was created Prince of Wales, the title traditionally held by the heir apparent. But unlike his father, whom the style and rank was bestowed 1 month after his birth in 1841, which he held for 60 years, Prince George, as Prince of Wales, was to be king in waiting for less than a decade. On the 6th of May, 1910, Edward VII died, 6 months short of his 69th birthday. The coronation of the new King George and Queen Mary, as Georgie and May had now become, took place at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of June the following year. Witnessing the epic ritual from the front of the royal gallery near the high altar were four of their children: Bertie, Mary, Harry, and George. David, who had succeeded his father as the 20th Prince of Wales, played his own part in the ceremony. When as heir to the throne, he knelt before the king to swear allegiance. If, however, the princes had behaved impeccably in the abbey, the same was not true afterwards, when all hell broke loose during the return procession to Buckingham Palace. The diarist, Lord Crawford, wrote, "One of the greatest successes of the coronation was a stand-up fight between the two kilted princesses, George and Harry. They were aged 9 and 11 respectively. But by some imprudence, the Prince of Wales and his sister were sent in a state coach with the younger brothers, but without a controlling prelate or pedagogue. When fairly started from the abbey, a free fight began to the huge delight of the spectators in Whitehall. The efforts of Princess Mary to mollify the combatants were sincere but ineffectual, and during the strife she nearly had her sweet little coronet knocked off. Peace was ultimately restored after 50 yards of hullabaloo. Another significant royal event that summer was David's ceremonial investiture at Caernarvon Castle as Prince of Wales. It was the nearest he would ever come to being crowned. At this time, the prince was in his second year at Dartmouth as a naval cadet, and thought the meaning of his investiture and the reasons for it being a public spectacle were clear to him. Other theatrical aspects of the ceremony caused embarrassment. Chief among them was a satin velvet ermine trimmed costume he was obliged to wear. Throughout his career as heir apparent, the golden boy of the empire, as he would become popularly known, and during this brief 11-month reign as King Edward VIII, David was amongst the most democratically inclined princes. Because of this, as he claimed in a television interview 40 years after his abdication, his seismic clash with the British establishment had been inevitable. Though Prince George was never to offer a direct challenge to the established view of monarchy, he was every bit as democratic as his eldest brother, and just as much as an individual. There were naturally marked differences in their characters, but even so, they were very alike in other respects. They shared the same sense of humor, the same energy, and the same passion for keeping fit. They had very similar tastes in music, especially jazz, which George would belt out on the piano at his brother's country house. Fort Belvedere on the edge of Windsor Great Park at weekend parties. They were both mimics and impersonators. They adored nightlife, though not to their credit, had a penchant for forming undesirable relationships. Yet his brother David also found a kind of mentor. Yet his brother David also found a kind of mentor, one to whom he would unburden himself in complete trust and confidence. In his memoirs, The King's Story, the by now Duke of Windsor wrote, although George was 8.5 years my junior, I found his character qualities that were akin to my own, and we became more than brothers. We became very close friends. This friendship and bond, Georgian, is very interesting, and you'll see it play out when King Edward abdicated. Although George was disappointed, he still never fully severed his ties with David. So, but there's reasons for it, and I think these are the virtues that David had with regard to his brother. There were some positive influences that David had over Prince George. There were negatives, but there were positives, and you'll see it in George's desire to serve his country with a purpose. But back to reading. Not long before his 14th birthday in 1916, Prince George embarked on what was arguably the unhappiest period of his life. Right from the start, he was horrified at the thought of having to follow David and Bertie into the Royal Navy. Indeed, the biographer, James Wentworth Day, had even claimed the prince's fondness for wearing a kilt had led him to hope that he might be permitted to join a Highland regiment. True or not, George's immediate future had been settled for him by the Lord High Admiral in person, in other words, by his father. In an attempt to dissuade her husband, from sending Georgie to Naval College, Queen Mary tried to make the king understand that it might do the boy more harm than good. It was unusual for the queen to intercede on her children's behalf at any time since, as she said herself, she had to always remember that their father was also their king, and they were all his subjects. In this instance, however, Queen Mary made an exception. Of all her children, she saw much of herself reflected in Prince George, not least in their shared appreciation of the arts. How well the Queen came to know and understand her sons and daughters is a moot point, but she was the first to realize the error of sending this particular son into an environment that his sensitive and artistic temperament would find completely alien. In the event, Queen Mary's argument fell on deaf ears. The king would not be moved. An estate Prince George might be, but a sailor he would become. On that note, the prince was packed off to the Junior Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight. At least to begin with, he seemed to settle in, applying himself dutifully to his studies and achieving far higher grades than either David or Bertie before him. But then, through boredom or unhappiness, perhaps, Prince George's concentration waned, and from the top of the scholastic ladder, he began slipping towards the bottom, where incidentally his brothers were always to be found. Languages were to prove George's saving grace, however. 4 years later, after leaving the Senior Naval Academy at Dartmouth in Devon, he attended a course at the Naval College at Greenwich in southeast London. There he gained his first place in French, his second in Italian in the voluntary examination in foreign languages for acting sub-lieutenants. Later still, his proficiency was further acknowledged when his duties started to include those of interpreter in French. Whatever services Prince George was able to offer the Navy was to disrupt his health. Seasickness and insomnia plagued him from the start of his voyage, and in 1929 were greatly contributed to his being relieved of the career his father had so ruthlessly imposed on him. In the years between, George had no choice but to make the most of a very disagreeable situation. In April 1920, at the age of 17, he passed out of Dartmouth, and 9 months later, newly promoted to the rank of midshipman, he was detailed to HMS Iron Duke, flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet. Service abroad, HMS Queen Elizabeth and the flotilla leader, HMS Mackay, then followed, and with subsequent promotion. He was appointed in turn to HMS Hawkins, the flagship in China, HMS Nelson, the flagship of the home fleet, and HMS Durban. Though Prince George's service caused him many regrets, life was not without compensation, nor indeed did PG, or Babe as he was known, ever lose his sense of humor. In Princess Marina, Her Life and Times, Stella King wrote, "Once in China, some press cameraman, hearing that British royalty was about, met him when he was about to board his ship and asked if he had seen the King of England. Without hesitation, he gestured behind him towards the ship's doctor, a heavenly built man who's being carried in a sedan chair, and left him to sort it out for themselves. He laughed a great deal when the portly doctor's picture appeared in a newspaper, later with a caption saying that he was the English king. Despite amusing episodes like this, the undisputed rewards of visiting far-flung places and the camaraderie of the ship's company, Prince George continued to petition his father for permission to leave the Royal Navy. Though the king would have none of it, George refused to let go of the hope that he might be allowed to do something more constructive with his life. And by 1928, that ambition was closer to being fulfilled than he really realized. During the Royal Ascot Week that year, Ma Belle, Countess of Airlie, who had frequently acted as confessor to the children of her old friend Queen Mary, was staying at Windsor Castle in her capacity as lady-in-waiting, a post she had held ever since May became Princess of Wales. At dinner one evening, the Dowager Countess was seated next to Prince George, who told her how much he was dreading his next voyage. Some years later, she published her autobiography, Thatched with Gold. Lady Airlie recalled, "He was not happy in the Navy and wanted to go into the civil service or the foreign service, but the king would not hear of it. His only reason for refusing is that it was never been done before." The prince said, "I've tried to make him see that I'm not cut out for the Navy, but it's no use. What can I do? I advised him not to waste time in arguing with the king, which would only make him angry, but to work hard while he was at sea, get the civil service papers, and do them, and then let his father see the results. He told me some time later that he'd acted on my advice, and that it had been successful. George V's change of heart was not due so much to the results of his son's civil service exam, but more persuasively to the medical reports that made it clear that George's digestive troubles would severely undermine his health were he to be forced to continue in the Navy." A year later, the prince was promoted to the rank of commander, and to his profound relief, finally discharged from the service. For the next 3 years, the king's son, the first prince ever to have become a civil servant, was attached to the Foreign Office. His duties there, however, did not prove sufficiently demanding. Like the Prince of Wales, George had a tremendous liking and admiration for the working man. And like David, he not only became interested in social and industrial conditions, but shared his brother's deep concern for the misery of the unemployed, who by 1931 totaled more than 2 million unemployed people. It was this very real social conscience. It formed largely through his experiences in the Navy, which led Prince George to change departments within the civil service. From his first desk at the Foreign Office overlooking St. James Park, he moved along Whitehall to the Home Office. This move, arranged by Sir Herbert Samuel, the Home Secretary, and Sir Malcolm Delavine, permanent Under Secretary of State, resulted in George becoming a Home Office factory inspector. In his initial report to Sir Herbert, Delvine itemized the scope of the prince's duties, notwithstanding the king's instruction that his son should remain available for royal engagements as and when required. He wrote, as his work will lie in the metropolitan area, we would propose to attach him to 3 London districts, South Warwick, Woolwich, and South Essex, in order to give him an interesting range of work as possible and at the same time allow some concentration of interest in the more important and live issues of factory administration. Among the more important and live issues to which his attention might be given are the work of the London docks, loading and unloading of ships, which are processes fruitful of accidents and are governed by an elaborate code of regulations, and which happen to be, at the moment, the subject of international discussion. The asbestos industry, with its newly discovered dangers to health, different branches of the engineering and woodworking industries, the building industry, with its recently amended code of safety regulations. It would also be arranged to let him see interesting developments in health and welfare work. The actual visiting of the factory should be alternated with visits to the Home Office, Industrial Museum, where he would be given some intensive instruction in the principles and practices of the safeguarding of machinery and prevention of various kinds of accidents, the nature and prevention of industrial diseases, and the promotion of industrial health and welfare, the principle of factory ventilation and lights, and so on. This is now part of the ordinary training of recruits to the factory inspectorate. With full approval of both the king and the prime minister, Stanley Baldwin, Prince George joined the Home Office on 12 April 1932. From the start, George took to his new occupation as if born to it. In many respects, the prince's work complemented that of another of his brothers, motivated by the very same wish to be of practical benefit to the ordinary man. Bertie, otherwise known as Prince Albert, Duke of York, had already become involved with industry under the auspices of the Industrial Welfare Association, of which he was president. The overall aim of the organization was to persuade Britain's industrial overlords to become more actively conscious of the need to improve working conditions for employees, to establish health centers and factory canteens, and to provide recreational facilities. As Sir John Wheeler Bennett, Bertie's official biography, was to put it, captains of industry and trade union leaders became regular callers on the Duke of York, and the Duke's influence made itself felt throughout the industrial life of Britain. But their insistence to be allowed to do something was useful. The foreman and the factory inspector, as Bertie and George were affectionately called by the members of their family. The foreman and the factory inspector. Okay. They proved that royalty could, and indeed wanted to be, more than ornamental baubles on the British establishment tree. Just a few more pages. This was a long chapter, but it's really very interesting. In his work for the Home Office, Prince George was popular and a conscientious member of the factory inspectorate. More to the point, he was of value both to his department and to those whose working conditions it was his responsibility to review. Like Bertie, Prince George was adamant that he should be allowed to do his job without ceremony. Employees were never to be given advance warning of his identity in order to avoid factories being smartened up or unwanted reception committees organized. In short, if his work was to be effective, George wanted to do it anonymously, as the rest of his Home Office colleagues. For the most part, this is exactly how it was. But it would be foolish to suggest that he was never recognized. Even at a time that knew nothing of the kind of technology and mass communication we take so much for granted, Prince George and his brothers were popular public figures whose photographs regularly graced newspapers and magazines. If, however, the Prince of Wales was generally considered to be the best looking and most charismatic of George's sons, a royal matinee idol adored by millions throughout the empire, George was a very close second. Physically, the younger prince was somewhat taller than his brother, and dark where the elder prince was fair. Both had blue eyes, though George's were of deeper hue. And where David's voice was comparatively strong with a slight inflection, often likened to Cockney, George's was fey and almost feminine. Toward the end of his life, David's features in certain moods assumed the look of his Hanoverian forebears, whereas Prince George, particularly in the set of his eyes and mouth, had always resembled the features of Britain's four Georges that continued to stare out at us from the court portraits by the likes of Zoffany, Gainsborough, Ramsay, and G. Etienne Leotard. After Prince George left the Royal Navy, he and the Prince of Wales became even closer. They even shared the same house. Like his great great uncle, King William IV, who called it a white elephant and might easily have sold it to the highest bidder, David had never liked Buckingham Palace, and during the mid 1920s had been delighted when his father agreed to his setting up home at York House, St. James's Palace. Once the official residence of George and Queen Mary, York House, and part of the rambling red brick Tudor palace that Henry VIII built for his second queen, Anne Boleyn. It stands on the site of 12th century hospital, St. James the Less, which at the time was a home for leprous maidens. Having George share York House away from the censorious eyes of their father was a great pleasure to the Prince of Wales, and between them they lived life to the full. David was fond of flying, steeplechasing, hunting, shooting, and golf, and was much at home in the company of sportsmen as he was in London's most fashionable nightclubs, perfecting the latest dances with his successive mistress, Miss Dudley Ward, Thelma, Viscountess Furness, and ultimately the twice married American Miss Ernest Simpson, whose name the entire world would soon come to know. Prince George shared his brother's passion for flying, but not for shooting. George preferred sailing and skiing. His love of nightlife, however, was every bit as strong as David's. With him on the dance floor at night spots, at private parties, and at other social get togethers was the vivacious Lady Alexandra Curzon, named after her godmother, Queen Alexandra, but otherwise known as Baba. She was the daughter of the Marquess Curzon, former Viceroy of India. In fact, she and George became so close that there was talk among their friends and in the press of a possible marriage. Nothing came of it, and when Baba, though she always remained very fond of the prince, married Edward Fruity Metcalf, a captain in the Indian Cavalry and a friend of the Prince of Wales. In 1925, George was deeply upset. That said, however, it wasn't long before George's passions were reignited, this time by banking heiress and fun-loving debutante Poppy Baring. Duff Cooper, later the first Viscount of Norwich, watched closely at events between them unfolded, and on 8 January 1927, he found Poppy sleeping peacefully in the arms of Prince George. 6 days later, he noticed that there was a talk of marriage, although Poppy herself said she couldn't bear the royal family, and to George's amusement often made jokes about them. At the end of the month, with his customary love of speed, the prince rushed off to tell his parents that he wanted to marry Poppy. According to Duff Cooper, the king and queen took it wonderfully and raised hardly an objection. But then, only 10 days later, it was all off. For reasons he either didn't know or was too discreet to divulge, Duffy Cooper wrote. Unfavorable reports about poor Poppy appear to have reached His Majesty's ears, so the girls sunk. For Prince George, like many other aristocratic young men, stage door Johnnies, as many of them became known, the lure of the theater, and particularly of showgirls, it was intoxicating. At a time when the general rule was you could sleep with anyone who didn't threaten your position or your career, and when showgirls were looked down upon, actresses so often fitted this bill. Certainly, George's taste in women, both before and after his marriage, recognized no boundaries. Indeed, the African American singer, dancer, and comedian Florence Mill, whom George had first met in London in 1926 during the hit run of Blackbirds, when Charles B. Cochrane's revues, became one of his mistresses, while the movie stars Lois Sturt, Gloria Swanson, and Tallulah Bankhead also crossed his paths. For those who could afford it, Jazz Age London in the 1920s was the place to be. It was an exciting post-war world, and George and his brother David were right in the thick of it. The jazz musician Tiny Winters, who often saw the princes together at fashionable West End night spots, such as Quaglino's and the Embassy Club, recalled one occasion when they stayed on all night at the latter venue. The moment they left, said Winters, the band shot out to catch the buses, and as they did so, ran into the royal brothers, who just got into the street. One of them got the other's top hat, and this time, when silk toppers, white ties, and tails were worn. They climbed up the lamppost, stuck it on the iron bar. Then the other one climbed up and got it. After that, they were chasing one after another, grabbing their top hats and kicking them all over the street. Not all Prince George's activities were as knockabout or innocent. At the end of 1920s, Alice Gwynne, who was far better known as Kiki Whitney Preston, a beautiful, if wild, American socialite and prominent member of Kenya's Losh Happy Valley set, composed very largely of hedonistic aristocratic and adventurers, introduced Prince George to heroin, cocaine, and morphine. Because of her own drug addiction, Kiki, whose lovers also included Rudolph Valentino and George Ferrara, the bisexual son of Argentinian ambassador to London, with whom she and Prince George reportedly shared a menage a trois, earned for herself the nickname the girl with the silver syringe. Said to have miscarried a child that it was speculated may have been fathered by Prince George, Kiki was confronted by Prince of Wales and persuaded to leave England. In the meantime, the prince took it upon himself to oversee his brother's recovery from the drug addiction. Installed in a quiet country location and attended by qualified nursing staff, as well as the Prince of Wales himself, George's painful rehabilitation took some time. On one occasion, David wrote to his then mistress, Frida Dudley Ward, "The cure has reached a rather tricky stage. I'm carrying out the work of doctor, jailer, and detective. The old saying, 'boys will be boys,' is all right until you get too old and should know the form better. He seems to lack all sense of knowing what is so obviously the wrong thing to do." So I think that, to me, was the defining moment for George, with David really helping him through this drug addiction. He could never fully abandon his brother, who would later abdicate his throne. There was a, a decent bond between them that stayed. Then, as now, the rich and the highborn, with time on their hands, like minded company, and money to burn, are among those who thought little of experimenting with drugs. But the king's son should have been one of them, and should have become seriously addicted, and revealed an unfortunate flaw in Prince George's character. Drugs, however, were not his only weakness. He was also promiscuous, self indulgent, and oversexed. He was a man who, it said at the time, would not be safe in a taxi with anyone of either sex. Ooh. A result of his sexual adventures, questions of paternity would be raised on more than one occasion. Indeed, Kiki Whitney Preston had miscarried George's child, another of his conquests, as author and journalist Christopher Wilson revealed in a newspaper article published in July 2013. He did have a child who survived into adulthood. Violet Evans, the daughter of a wealthy Canadian coal merchant, was the sister of one of George's friends from his Naval College days, and it was through her brother William that Violet met and became involved with Prince George. In 1926, she gave birth to a son who was adopted by an American-born, London-based book publisher, Cass Canfield, and renamed Michael Temple Canfield. In April 1953, at the age of 27, he married his first wife, Lee Bouvier, young sister of Jacqueline Kennedy. Ooh, wow. Quite a connection there. After they were divorced, Canfield married British aristocrat Laura Charteris, the ex-wife of both the second Viscount Long and the third of Earl Dudley, the future wife of the 10th Duke of Marlborough. On one occasion, after they married, in 1960, Laura and Michael lunched with Prince George's brother David and his wife, by now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. In her autobiography, Laughter from a Cloud, Laura recalled how over lunch the Duke never stopped staring at Michael. So much so that I asked, "Is anything the matter?" The Duke quietly replied, "Yes, I am certain your husband is my brother's son." Another similar claim would one day be made by the novelist Barbara Cartland, who maintained that Prince George was the biological father of her daughter Rain McCorkindale, who, as Countess Spencer, would become the stepmother of Diana, Princess of Wales. Oh boy, well, if that's true, we now see Prince George got around. He was quite a player. Throughout his adult life, George's physical attraction to women was matched by an equally strong attraction to his own sex, with a particular penchant for the blonde good looks of German boys. Back then, however, gay sex between men was illegal and it was dangerous. In fact, until the law was first changed some 40 years later, homosexual activity was punishable by imprisonment, and in some parts of the world, even by death. It is therefore fortunate for George that his position would afford him greater protection from prosecution, though not from the ability to jeopardize his own reputation as well as that of the monarchy itself. That threat became a reality when, by the end of the 1920s, George's careless indiscretions meant he started leaving compromising evidence of his homosexuality. It is known that on one occasion Buckingham Palace had sent two emissaries to Paris. Acting on behalf of the king, they burgled the apartment of one of George's boyfriends in order to retrieve a gold box with a personal inscription on the lid, together with number of highly personal and indiscriminating letters. Anthony Blunt, a third cousin of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, one-time surveyor of the king's and later the Queen's pictures, and a Soviet spy, he was unmasked as the fourth man in the infamous Cambridge spy ring that included Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and Donald MacLean. He was on the list of George's reported lovers, as was Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, who described George as artistic and effeminate and used strong perfume. It was a description that not only chimed with George's liking for dressing up, but also with the story of a visit he made backstage in the Phoenix Theater after the performance of the 1930 comedy Private Lives. The star of the show was a celebrated Gertrude Lawrence, who, on returning to his dressing room, was surprised and bemused to find Prince George sitting in front of her dressing table, mirroring trying on one of her wigs, completed with hair ornaments. It was another of George's penchants the public would know nothing about, nor would the public know of the relationship Prince George had with Noel Coward, the flamboyant author of Private Lives, who found international fame as a playwright, composer, director, actor, singer, and wit. The Master, as Coward became known in the theater world, described his liaison with Prince George as a little dalliance, and although Graham Payne, another of Coward's lovers, denied it was ever physical. Charles Russell, in his New York representative, told the author Michael Thornton that Noel used to refer constantly to his affair with the Duke of Kent. He seemed rather proud of it, and at times was almost a bore on the subject. Adding fuel to the fire, it was reported at the time that security services were aware that Prince George and Noel Coward had been seen parading together throughout the streets of London, dressed and made up as women, and had once been arrested by the police. They were, of course, released when the true identity of the two ladies was discovered. Besides the more scandalous or the least more salacious episodes that define George's private life, there was also the aspect of his character. As touched upon earlier, he cared deeply about the things of beauty, from priceless works of art to interior decoration. As a bachelor prince, he received an official civil list allowance of $10,000 a year until he married. Then his tax-free income was increased to £25,000. In today's currency, literally worth a king's ransom. Yet even on an annuity of £10,000 a year, George accumulated a very fine collection of antique furniture, first edition books, Georgian silver, porcelain, bibelots, pictures, including the famous Altieri Claudes entitled The Father of the Psyche Sacrificing at the Temple of Apollo, and landscape with the arrival of Aeneas before the city of Pallanteum by the French 17th century landscape, Claude Lorraine, which were brought to England to great acclaim by the art collector William Beckford in 1799. Of Prince George's own prowess as a collector, the late Sir Oliver Miller survey of the Queen's pictures from 1972 to 1988 said that he was the most distinguished royal connoisseur since George IV. And that is the end of the chapter. So that was life as George as a bachelor and in the Navy, and he had vices and virtues, and but he was great. I mean, he had a wonderful taste. He was very intelligent. He would have made a probably a very good king. But anyway, the next chapter is going to discuss more about the Duke and Duchess of Kent. So I'll end it here now. This was a long chapter, but it was a good chapter into discovering what Prince George was really about, and it highlighted a little of the bond that David and George had. They were very close as brothers. So